In the early 20th century, a widow in her 60s sat in the living room of her boarding house as usual. In her hand was a tattered prayer book, ready to pray for herself. This woman ran the boarding house alone. In the past, she had made a living by renting out rooms. Although her life was not affluent, she always tried her best to create a cozy home for her tenants. On that evening, a young man named Earle Leonard Nelson arrived at her door. He claimed to be a devout Christian looking for a quiet place to rest. His appearance was gentle and polite, which put the woman at ease. She welcomed him warmly, as she did with other tenants, showing him around the rooms and explaining the rules of the house in detail. Nelson behaved respectfully during the tour, and his demeanor convinced the woman that he would be an ideal tenant. However, she had no idea that this seemingly pious young man harbored dark impulses within, nor could she imagine that this night would be her last. As dusk fell and the entire boarding house fell silent, she sat alone in the living room, preparing to begin her evening prayers once again. She had no idea that her new tenant had a nickname, the Gorilla Killer, and that she was about to become another victim of his brutal murders. The tragedy began on May 12, 1897, when Nelson was born in San Francisco, California. If life were to improve after hitting rock bottom, then for Nelson, his entire life was one of misfortune. It is said that his father was a drunkard and his mother a sex worker. Within just 2 years of his birth, both of them died of syphilis. Nelson's grandparents, devout Pentecostals, then took on the responsibility of raising their daughter's child. However, their age and personalities were not well suited to caring for a young boy. They lived a strict Puritan lifestyle, constantly suppressing their own emotions and feelings. For Nelson, a natural troublemaker, this stern family atmosphere was sheer torment. As a result, Nelson exhibited self-loathing and other pathological behaviors from a young age. At the age of 7, he was expelled from school for misbehavior. His teachers complained that the boy constantly talked to invisible people and frequently referenced a large beast from the Bible. He also had a habit of peeking at female family members undressing. So Nelson was described by everyone as a psychotic child. Even his own grandmother thought so. She noted that Nelson would sometimes go to school in freshly cleaned clothes, only to return home in tattered garments, as if he had exchanged clothes with a homeless person. When Nelson was 10 years old, he was involved in an accident with a streetcar while riding his bicycle. Blood gushed from one of his temples, and after the doctor's best efforts, they believed he would not survive. Strangely, however, he awoke from a coma just a few days later. But the accident haunted him for the rest of his life. He suffered from frequent headaches and memory loss, and began to exhibit unstable behavior. As Nelson entered his teenage years and puberty, his curiosity about women grew stronger. He frequently visited the brothels and bars in San Francisco's Barbary Coast red light district and contracted a sexually transmitted disease. His mental illness also worsened. He often subjected his family members to bizarre physical acts, such as walking on his hands or attempting to lift heavy objects with his teeth. Nelson had suffered a head injury that led to a decrease in his intelligence and significant memory loss. In 1918, a Navy psychiatrist indicated that Nelson was living in a constitutional psychopathic state, which means he had congenital psychopathy. This implied that he had difficulties in cognition and behavioral control, making his criminal activities almost inevitable. At the age of 18, Nelson went to a rural area in Plumas County, where he broke into a cabin, thinking it was abandoned, and took it over. For this offense, he was sentenced to 2 years in San Quentin State Prison. Although he was paroled after a year, over the next 2 years, Nelson was frequently arrested for minor thefts and burglaries. At the end of 1917, Nelson enlisted in the military but deserted after 6 weeks. This became a pattern for him as he repeatedly joined different branches of the military under various names and then deserted. In 1918, at the age of 21, Nelson joined the U.S. Navy. During a military training session, his bizarre and unstable behavior led to his admission to Napa State Mental Hospital. After observation, one psychiatrist concluded that Nelson did not exhibit violence, homicidal tendencies, or destructiveness. Another psychiatrist noted that Nelson had hallucinations and other paranoid delusions. Nelson often claimed to see people that others could not see, hear music that others could not hear, and sometimes believed that someone was poisoning him. He also heard strange and terrifying voices urging him to commit suicide. The poor man, Nelson, stated that if he were imprisoned, he would surely take some sharp object and cut the veins in his wrists. This psychiatrist also mentioned that Nelson experienced severe headaches during their conversations and had fainted on multiple occasions. During his confinement, Nelson attempted to escape several times until the staff eventually stopped searching for him. In 1919, Nelson was officially discharged from the U.S. Navy, and his hospital records were closed with a note indicating that his condition had improved after treatment. After escaping, Nelson found a job as a janitor at St. Mary's Hospital. This job required no skills or qualifications. It was here that he met Mary Martin, a 60-year-old administrator. The two began dating and reportedly got married, but the marriage was short-lived. Nelson turned the woman's life into a living hell with his strange jealousy and anger, bizarre sexual demands, religious delusions, and increasingly violent behavior. This led to their separation after just 6 months of cohabitation. Later, Martin recalled various strange behaviors she had witnessed while living with Nelson, including his long absences from home and unusual bathing habits, such as pouring water over his toes. On May 19, 1921, Nelson posed as a plumber and entered a residence on Pacific Avenue in San Francisco, where he attempted to molest a 12-year-old girl. However, the girl was very clever. She screamed frantically, trying to alert her brother to call for help, which caused Nelson to flee in fear. He was arrested a few hours later while riding a handcart. At the subsequent hearing, Nelson was identified as a dangerous individual and was sent back to Napa State Mental Hospital. There, he attempted to escape twice before being discharged in 1925. In 1926, Nelson began his horrific spree of murders. His first known victim was Clara Newman, a 60-year-old wealthy landlady living in San Francisco. On February 20th, he posed as a new tenant named Roger Wilson and entered her boarding house at 2037 Pierce Street. Once inside, Nelson strangled her, raped her corpse, and hid her body in an empty room in the house. Just a month later, on March 2nd, his second victim emerged. In San Jose, near San Francisco, 63-year-old Laura Beale was strangled to death in her home. His criminal actions then became more frequent. On June 26th, he strangled 63-year-old Lillian Mary in San Francisco and raped her corpse. 2 weeks later, he continued his crimes in California. In Santa Barbara, 325 miles south of San Francisco, 53-year-old Ollie Russell was strangled with a rope in her boarding house. The autopsy confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted after death. The similarities in the modus operandi to the San Francisco murders led the police to suspect a connection between these cases. On August 16th, Mary Nisbet, a 52-year-old apartment building owner in Oakland, was found dead in the bathroom of an empty apartment by her husband. She had been strangled and raped. Initially, local law enforcement questioned whether Nisbet's husband was involved in her death, but he was soon cleared of suspicion. Later, witnesses told the police that they had seen a smiling stranger lurking outside her apartment building on the day of Nisbet's murder. Others who claimed to have seen Nelson at various boarding houses described him as a dark, stocky man with long arms and large hands. Because of this, newspapers began to call him the Dark Strangler and the Gorilla Killer. In the fall, Nelson moved to Portland, Oregon. On October 19th, he raped and murdered 35-year-old landlady Beata Withers, the first of several victims he would kill in Portland. Her body was discovered by her teenage son, hidden under clothes in a steamer trunk in her attic. The next day, 59-year-old Virginia Grant was murdered in a vacant property on East 22nd Street, with her body concealed behind a basement furnace in her home. On October 21st, landlady Mabel Fluke disappeared from her home in Portland. A few days later, her body was found in the attic, strangled with a scarf. After committing 3 murders in Portland, Nelson briefly returned to San Francisco and raped and murdered 56-year-old widow Willie Anna Edmonds on November 18th. Initially, the police were reluctant to attribute the crime to the Dark Strangler. However, a few days after the murder, a friend of Edmonds told the police that she had visited Edmonds' home on the day of the murder and found her in the living room talking to a strange man about a business deal involving the sale of her house. The woman's description of the unknown man matched that of the gorilla killer. On November 19th, a 28-year-old pregnant woman near Burlingame, California, was attacked while showing her house to a man posing as a potential buyer. She survived the assault and described the man as about 5 feet 8 inches tall, well-dressed, and articulate. The woman later told reporters that although she had not felt threatened initially, she recalled that the man had commented on the intricate details of the house, especially the ceilings. "I now realize that he was trying to get me to look up at the ceiling so he could slip behind me and grab my throat," she said. On November 29th, Nelson murdered and raped Blanche Myers at her home in Portland. During the investigation, police found a fingerprint on Myers' iron bedpost. Although fingerprint technology was still in its early stages at the time, this discovery was undoubtedly a significant breakthrough. The Portland murders also sparked a public frenzy, with the Oregonian reporting that the third floor of the Portland Police Department had turned into a veritable madhouse, with officers receiving hundreds of calls and reports of suspicious individuals. A local woman claimed that a suspicious man had stayed at her boarding house for a few days after Thanksgiving under the name Adrian Harris. She said that on the day Myers was murdered, the man had told her and other residents that he was leaving to take a train to Vancouver and would not be back. She found this suspicious because he had already paid for several days' rent in advance. Before leaving, he had also given her and another boarder jewelry as a gift. The police later confirmed that the jewelry belonged to Florence Monks, a wealthy widow who had been murdered and raped in Seattle on November 23rd. To prevent further murders, law enforcement agencies in California and Oregon issued public safety announcements to citizens. In the San Francisco Bay Area, elderly women were advised to take precautions when renting out rooms and inviting strangers into their homes. Meanwhile, the Portland Police Department issued the following statement to the public: "Do not show your house or rooms for rent when you are alone. If necessary, ask the police to accompany you. Such crimes should be prevented." They could have been avoided if women had been more careful. I do not want to unduly alarm the people of Portland, but there is no denying that the situation is serious. In late November, Nelson left Portland and continued his killing spree, moving eastward and traveling by hitchhiking or sneaking onto trains. His criminal trail stretched from the West Coast to the Midwest and East Coast of the United States. On December 23rd, the body of 41-year-old Amira Berard was found in her home in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Her body was garlanded with a shirt. Initially, local police ruled her death as a suicide, as Berard had recently been discharged from a mental hospital. However, subsequent findings of signs of sexual assault led to the reversal of this decision, and the case was reclassified as a murder. On December 27, 23-year-old Bonnie Pace was strangled and raped in her home in Kansas City, Missouri. Her body was discovered by her husband in an upstairs room. Just one day later, on December 28th, 28-year-old Germania Harpen and her 8-month-old son were found murdered in their home in Kansas City. Both had been strangled, her son with a diaper, and Germania had been raped after death. They were discovered by her husband when he returned home from work that evening. On April 27, 1927, Nelson murdered and raped 53-year-old landlady Mary McConnell in Philadelphia. Several pieces of jewelry were also stolen from her residence. The next day, Nelson attempted to sell one of her gold watches to a pawnbroker, but was refused. On May 27th, Nelson arrived in Buffalo, New York, where he rented a room from 53-year-old Jenny Randolph under the name Charles Harrison. 3 days later, Jenny was found strangled and raped, her body stuffed under her bed. Jenny's brother had encountered Harrison, describing him as appearing about 33 years old, short and stout, with dark complexion and black hair combed back. Boarders at Jenny's house later positively identified Nelson as Charles Harrison. On June 1st in Detroit, Michigan, boarding house manager Fannie Mae and boarder Maureen Atorthy were found murdered in the boarding house under May's supervision. Their remains were discovered by the building's owner, Leonard Sink. May had been strangled with a wire cut from a table lamp. Police determined that the wire had been cut while the electricity was still running, as the knife used to cut it showed obvious signs of burning and a notched blade. On June 3rd, he murdered 27-year-old Mary Cecilia Sitzma in Chicago, Illinois. Sitzma was found by her husband on the floor of their home, strangled with an electrical cord. On June 8th, a series of shocking murders occurred in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. 14-year-old Lola Cowan mysteriously disappeared after leaving home to sell artificial flowers door to door. Just 2 days later, on June 10th, another local woman also vanished. That evening, her husband discovered her body while kneeling beside his son's bed for evening prayers. She had been raped, strangled, and showed signs of being struck with a claw hammer. Upon investigation, police found that several items were missing from her home, including a set of riding reins, her gold wedding ring, a family Bible, and a $10 bill. Additionally, a knife with burn marks and scratches was left at the scene, matching the knife used to cut the lamp wire in May's murder the previous week. This discovery led police to realize the connection between the cases. The next day, a local Winnipeg jeweler unknowingly purchased a gold ring for $3.50 Canadian dollars from a man who later turned out to be Nelson. The ring was confirmed to be the woman's wedding ring. Stolen clothes from her home were also found being sold at a second-hand store nearby. Both the jeweler and the clothing store owner positively identified the man who had sold the items as Nelson. A barber who owned a shop next to the second-hand store also provided a crucial lead to the police. He said that on the afternoon of June 10th, he had given a shave, haircut, and massage to a man who closely resembled Nelson. While cutting the man's hair, he noticed dried blood and scratches on his scalp. When he inquired about the source of these marks, the man became agitated and demanded that he not touch his hair. On June 12th, Winnipeg police conducted a city-wide search of rooming houses. While searching the boarding house at 133 Smith Street, where Nelson had recently resided, police discovered a decomposing body under the bed in Nelson's room. It was the missing Cowan, whose body had been dismembered in a manner reminiscent of Jack the Ripper's victims. Her clothes and personal items were also missing. After the discovery of Cowan's body, the Winnipeg City Council offered a reward of 1,500 Canadian dollars for information leading to the conviction of the perpetrator. This reward subsequently became a matter of controversy, with several individuals coming forward with information about Nelson's whereabouts, including a driver who claimed to have transported Nelson from Emerson to Winnipeg on the day Cowan disappeared. In June 1927, while investigating the Winnipeg murders, Canadian police suspected that Nelson might have fled to the United States. To locate him quickly, they sent detailed descriptions of him to police departments and post offices across the United States. During this period, reports surfaced of sightings of a man matching Nelson's description in Regina, Saskatchewan, and in Boissavin, Manitoba. On June 14th, a man identifying himself as Mike Mofsky was arrested by customs officers in the small town of Wauwunessa, on the border between Manitoba and Minnesota. This man's appearance closely matched Nelson's description, but he managed to escape the next day. Just 2 days later, on June 16th, in the border town of Killinick, Manitoba, only 12 miles from the North Dakota border, officers arrested a man named Vigil Wilson, who also fit Nelson's description. Reportedly, the man was so calm and cooperative during his arrest that officers even doubted they had the right person. Nelson was detained in a local jail, but he managed to escape that very night. However, fate was not on his side. He attempted to flee by train, but the next morning he was formally arrested again by an officer from the Crystal City Police Department on a railway line 47 miles east of Wauwunessa. He was then taken to the Rupert Street Police Station in Winnipeg, where he was photographed, fingerprinted, measured, and prepared for identification. Nearly 4,000 spectators waited outside the station, hoping to catch a glimpse of the suspect. The photographs taken by the Winnipeg police were quickly sent to police departments across the United States, leading to positive identifications by witnesses in Illinois and California, who claimed that the man matched the same unidentified renter they had encountered. Despite Nelson's insistence that his name was Vigil Wilson, fingerprints forwarded from the San Francisco Police Department to Winnipeg confirmed that his identity matched the one from his previous arrests. Nelson's fingerprints also matched those found at multiple crime scenes, and his teeth matched the marks found on the victims. Initially, he confessed to the crimes, candidly telling reporters, "I only kill my ladies on Saturday nights." However, he later retracted his confession, claiming innocence. Shortly after his arrest, in an interview with the Manitoba Free Press, he said, "I am charged with 2 murders, but I am not the one who committed them." When asked about the individuals in the United States and Canada who positively identified him as the perpetrator, he simply replied, "They are all mistaken." Despite attempts by law enforcement agencies in both the United States and Canada to extract a confession, Nelson refused to admit to any of the murders he was suspected of or charged with. Nelson's trial began on November 1st, 1927, at the Winnipeg courthouse. His former wife, Martin, testified against him, describing him as a man who was absolutely insane. In addition, over 60 witnesses from both Canada and the United States testified that they had seen Nelson at the crime scenes, or could link him to the stolen property from the victims' homes. During the trial, a prison guard noted that Nelson was particularly fascinated by a passage from the Book of Proverbs, which reads, "My son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increaseth the transgressors among men." On November 5th, the closing arguments were completed, and after 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Nelson guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. Nelson maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but he was unable to counter the evidence presented by the police. However, his attorney never gave up on him. He submitted a 30-page document to the Minister of Justice, pleading for leniency for Nelson on the grounds of his mental derangement and congenital psychopathy. Nelson's personal history had also been unfairly presented to the jury by the media, meaning that the jurors were not impartial. They might have been predisposed to believe Nelson was guilty. These documents included 20 affidavits from people who had known Nelson all their lives, swearing that they could fully understand Nelson's character and state of mind. They unreservedly and without exaggeration believed that Nelson had been mentally unsound for a long period of time. Despite the numerous affidavits, the appeal was denied, and Nelson's execution was not stayed. At 7:30 a.m. on January 13, 1928, at Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg, Nelson was hanged. His last words were, "I forgive those who have wronged me."